You did the work. You went inward. You faced your patterns. You healed wounds that once defined you. And yet, something feels wrong. Not painful in the way it used to be, but unfamiliar. Quiet. Empty in a way you weren't prepared for. You were told healing would bring clarity, peace, a stronger sense of self. So why do you feel more lost now than before? Why does life feel flatter, relationships more distant, and the version of you that once felt certain suddenly unavailable? This is the part no one prepares you for. Because what you're experiencing doesn't mean healing failed. And it doesn't mean you broke something inside yourself. It means you crossed a threshold. Most conversations about spiritual awakening focus on the beginning, the moment of insight, the relief, the emotional release. But almost no one talks about what happens after. After the old pain is gone, after the coping mechanisms dissolve, after the identity that was built around survival no longer holds. There is a space that opens then, a space between who you were and who you haven't become yet. And that space can feel disorienting, lonely, even frightening. Today, we're not talking about awakening as inspiration, not as light, not as something impressive. We're talking about the part that feels like a mistake. The moment you wonder if the awakening itself was a lie, because instead of feeling whole, you feel unanchored. If this feels familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, there's nothing wrong with you. Let's talk about what's really happening. What most people call spiritual awakening is built around a promise of arrival, that if you do enough inner work, one day you will reach a place where things finally make sense, where you feel aligned, centered, certain. This promise is subtle but powerful. It shows up in the way healing is talked about, in before and after stories, in the quiet expectation that once you heal, life should feel lighter, clearer, more stable. And when that doesn't happen, the mind looks for a reason. Maybe I didn't heal deeply enough. Maybe I missed a step. Maybe I went too far. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The problem is not that healing failed. The problem is the promise itself. From a psychological perspective, awakening was never meant to give you a finished identity. It was never meant to make you feel permanently safe or certain. What it actually does is remove the structures that once gave you orientation. Old beliefs fall away. Old emotional reflexes lose their grip. Old roles stop making sense. And for a while, nothing replaces them. This is where many people feel betrayed. Because what they were promised was clarity. But what they received was openness. They were promised peace. But they received silence. They were promised a stronger sense of self. But instead, the familiar version of themselves quietly dissolved. And that can feel like loss. Especially if your identity was built around survival, around being needed, around being strong, around holding things together. Healing doesn't destroy those qualities, but it takes away the necessity of them. And when necessity disappears, meaning often goes with it, at least temporarily. This is why awakening is so often misunderstood. It's described as an upgrade, as something added to the personality. But psychologically, it works in the opposite direction. It subtracts. It subtracts the stories you used to tell yourself, the emotional contracts you lived inside, the unconscious roles that once gave you a place in the world. And when those are gone, the psyche enters a neutral zone. Not broken, not healed, not complete, just open. This is the first reason people feel lost after healing. Not because they lost themselves, but because the old map no longer works. And without a map, even familiar terrain can feel disorienting. The mistake is assuming something went wrong here. In reality, this confusion is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that something false has fallen away, and something real has not yet taken its place. That space is uncomfortable, but it is not empty by accident. It exists for a reason, and to understand that reason, We need to look at what actually collapses when healing begins to work. Because the next thing that dissolves is not your pain. It's your persona. When healing begins to work, the first thing that quietly loosens is not your pain, but the structure that once organized your entire sense of self. Your persona. The persona is not simply a social mask. It is the psychological system you built to survive. The version of you that learned how to be accepted, how to stay safe, how to read rooms, manage expectations, and remain emotionally functional inside families, relationships, and social environments that often demanded adaptation long before they offered understanding. Over time, this system becomes so refined that it stops feeling like a strategy. It starts to feel like personality, like identity, like who you fundamentally are. And because it worked, because it kept you connected and protected, you rarely questioned it. But healing changes the internal conditions that once made the persona necessary. The fears that powered it begin to soften. The hypervigilance that maintained it begins to relax. The emotional debts you once felt obligated to pay lose their urgency. And slowly, without drama or announcement, the persona begins to loosen. You can still function. You still know how to speak, how to engage, how to show up appropriately. From the outside, very little appears different. But internally, something essential has shifted. The emotional glue that once held the role in place dissolves. You may find yourself participating in the same conversations, inhabiting the same spaces, performing the same behaviors, yet feeling strangely detached from them, as if you are watching yourself move through a life that once felt natural but now feels oddly unfamiliar. This is deeply unsettling, because the persona was not only how you related to others, it was how you related to yourself. It gave you feedback, orientation, and meaning. It told you who you were based on how you were received. When that internal reference point weakens, a quiet disorientation sets in. Not the sharp pain of crisis, not the relief of resolution, but a kind of psychological silence. This is often the moment people begin to worry that something has gone wrong. They describe feeling flat, neutral, unmotivated. They wonder if they are dissociating, if healing has erased something essential. But what is actually happening is far more precise. You are no longer fused with the role. You are beginning to experience the persona as something you were rather than something you are. And that distinction, while subtle, changes everything. From the outside, this shift can be confusing and even threatening to others. You may seem less reactive, less eager to please, less emotionally responsive in the ways people were accustomed to. The familiar cues are missing. The predictable feedback loops no longer activate. And so people say what they always say when a system destabilizes. You've changed. You're distant. You're not like you used to be. They are correct, but not because something has gone wrong. You haven't become colder. You've become less performative. And performance, more than most people realize, is what many relationships unconsciously rely on. Shared roles, shared emotional contracts, shared expectations about who will carry which feelings. When one person quietly steps out of that arrangement, the system feels exposed. Not because you are doing anything wrong, but because you are no longer predictable. This is why the loss of the persona can feel like a loss of identity. Not because you no longer exist, but because the structure that once told you who you were allowed to be is no longer in control. And once that structure loosens, something else inevitably comes into view. Because beneath the persona is not clarity or peace. Beneath it is uncertainty. And beneath that uncertainty are the parts of yourself you were too busy performing to fully encounter. The shadow. And that is where the sense of being lost often intensifies, not as a sign of regression, but as a sign that something deeper is finally being seen. Once the persona loosens, many people expect clarity to appear. They imagine that beneath the mask there will be a truer version of themselves waiting, confident, grounded, fully formed. But that expectation is another quiet illusion, because what usually appears first is not a new identity. It is emptiness. Not the emptiness of despair, but the absence of structure. The strange sensation of no longer being pulled by the same emotional reflexes, while not yet being guided by anything new. The old motivations no longer dominate, but new ones have not taken shape. And the psyche does not like this state. The human mind is designed to orient itself through meaning. It wants direction, narrative, and continuity. So when the familiar reference points disappear, the experience can feel disturbing, even frightening. People often describe it in subtle ways. I don't know what I want anymore. I don't feel driven like I used to. I'm not sad, but I'm not excited either. I feel like I'm floating without an anchor. This is the space almost no one talks about, because it doesn't look like progress, and it doesn't feel like success. From the outside, it can resemble stagnation. From the inside, it can feel like something essential has gone missing. But psychologically, this void has a very specific function. It is the space created when unconscious structures dissolve faster than conscious ones can replace them. Jung understood this phase well. He saw it not as failure, but as a necessary suspension, a pause in which the psyche withdraws old investments so that deeper material can surface. And what surfaces next is rarely pleasant, because beneath the persona is not a clean slate. Beneath it is the shadow. The shadow is not simply the dark parts of the personality. It is everything that was pushed aside, minimized, or denied in order to maintain the identity you once needed to survive. Unexpressed anger, unacknowledged resentment, hidden desires, disowned impulses, grief that never had space to be felt. When the persona weakens, these elements no longer stay buried. Not explosively, not dramatically. They emerge quietly through mood shifts, discomfort, and emotional ambiguity. You may notice that your tolerance for certain situations decreases, that your reactions feel less predictable, that emotions you thought were resolved resurface without a clear cause. This can be deeply confusing, because you did the work, you processed the trauma, you understood the patterns. So why does it feel like more is appearing instead of less? The answer is not that healing opened old wounds. It is that healing removed the defenses that kept those wounds out of awareness. The shadow does not appear because something went wrong. It appears because there is finally enough internal stability to face what was previously too threatening to acknowledge. This is where many people misinterpret the experience and turn against themselves. They assume they are regressing. They assume healing made them worse. They assume they have uncovered something broken or dangerous inside. But Jung's perspective was very different. He believed that what we refuse to see in ourselves does not disappear. It operates unconsciously, shaping behavior from the shadows. And when consciousness expands, those hidden elements must either be integrated or acted out blindly. The discomfort you feel in this phase is not a sign of collapse. It is the friction that occurs when awareness meets what was once avoided. And that friction can feel like being lost. Not because you no longer have direction, but because the old directions no longer dominate. This is why the void after healing often feels heavier than the pain before it. Pain, at least, gives you a story. The void offers none. It simply asks you to stay present without knowing who you are becoming. And that demand, to remain without filling the space too quickly, is one of the most difficult psychological tasks there is, because the mind wants resolution. But this phase is not meant to be resolved yet. It is meant to be inhabited. And when it is misunderstood or rushed, something else begins to happen. The nervous system reacts. And that reaction is often the reason people say they feel worse after healing, even when they are not. That is what we need to look at next. After the persona loosens and the inner void opens, many people assume the discomfort they feel is purely psychological. They interpret the confusion as emotional, existential, or cognitive, and begins searching for explanations in thoughts, memories, or unresolved meaning. But a large part of what makes this phase feel so unsettling has very little to do with thought alone. It is physiological. The nervous system does not reorganize at the same speed as insight. For a long time, your internal system was calibrated around adaptation, anticipation, and subtle threat detection. Even when life appeared calm on the surface, your body remained oriented toward readiness, scanning, adjusting, compensating, preparing for what might happen next. Healing slowly changes these conditions. The chronic tension begins to soften. The background vigilance quiets. The constant internal pressure to brace yourself eases. And paradoxically, this can feel worse before it feels better. Because the nervous system is deeply familiar with activation. It knows how to function under urgency. It knows how to move when there is pressure, conflict, or emotional intensity organizing your days. What it does not immediately know how to do is exist without those signals. So when the chaos recedes, the system can misinterpret the absence of stimulation as a problem. The mind begins searching for something to react to. The body feels restless without a clear reason. Energy drops, motivation fades, and a vague sense of unease settles in, not sharp enough to name, but persistent enough to notice. People often describe this as feeling off. Not anxious in the traditional sense. Not depressed in the clinical sense. Just unsettled, as if something essential is missing without knowing what it is. And because there is no obvious threat or crisis to point to, the experience becomes even more confusing. The mind starts looping through questions that don't lead anywhere. Why do I feel flat if I'm healthier? Why does calm feel uncomfortable? Why do I miss a version of myself that was clearly suffering? This is the moment when many people quietly turn against their own healing. They begin to wonder if they went too far. If they dismantled something they shouldn't have touched. If the stability they expected was replaced by emptiness. But what is actually happening here is a recalibration. The nervous system is learning a new baseline. For years, intensity gave your life structure. Stress created momentum. Urgency provided a sense of purpose and direction. When those organizing forces dissolve, the system has to learn how to orient itself around something quieter. Choice instead of compulsion, presence instead of reaction, discernment instead of urgency. And those states do not activate the body in the same way. This is why stillness can feel uncomfortable. Why silence can feel heavy rather than peaceful. Why doing nothing wrong suddenly feels wrong. Your body is not craving pain. It is craving familiarity. And familiarity, even when harmful, often feels safer than the unknown. This is also why people sometimes feel drawn back toward old patterns during this phase. Old relationships, old conflicts, old emotional highs and lows. Not because they want to suffer again, but because the nervous system recognizes that terrain and knows how to survive inside it. Understanding this distinction matters. Without it, people pathologize a normal stage of integration. They label themselves unmotivated, broken, or stuck, when in reality the system is doing something intelligent. It is slowing down so it can reorganize without constant threat. This phase is not meant to feel productive or inspiring. It is meant to feel spacious. And spaciousness can be deeply uncomfortable for a system that learned safety through motion and pressure. The mistake is trying to fix this feeling too quickly, trying to force enthusiasm, trying to manufacture clarity, trying to rush purpose back into place. When you do that, you interrupt the very process that is unfolding. The discomfort does not mean you are moving backward. It means your body is learning how to live without constant threat, and that learning takes time. And as this recalibration continues, another shift becomes unavoidable. Your tolerance for certain relationships begins to change. And that change is often where the sense of loss becomes most visible. As the nervous system begins to recalibrate, another change quietly emerges, one that often feels more painful than the internal confusion itself. Your tolerance for certain relationships begins to shift. Not because you suddenly become detached or indifferent, but because the way you experience connection changes. Interactions that once felt normal now feel draining. Conversations that used to pass the time begin to feel empty. Emotional dynamics you once managed instinctively start to feel heavy, unnecessary, or even intrusive. This can be deeply unsettling, because for a long time, relationships were not just about connection. They were part of your regulation system. They gave structure to your identity, feedback to your sense of self, and purpose to your emotional energy. When healing changes the internal system, those external arrangements no longer function the same way. You may notice that you no longer have the same patience for subtle manipulation, guilt-based expectations, or unspoken emotional contracts. You become less willing to explain yourself endlessly, less inclined to smooth over discomfort, less able to pretend interest where none exists. This does not come from superiority. It comes from clarity. But clarity often looks like withdrawal to those who benefited from your old patterns. Friends may feel you pulling back. Family members may sense distance. Colleagues may interpret your neutrality as disinterest or judgment. And because people tend to personalize change, your inner reorganization is often received as rejection. You're not as available as you used to be. You've changed. You're harder to reach. What is rarely acknowledged is that you are not withdrawing from connection itself. You are withdrawing from unconscious connection, from roles that required you to carry more emotional weight than was ever yours, from dynamics that depended on your reactivity, your overfunctioning, or your silence. As these patterns dissolve, a period of loneliness often follows. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of transition. You are no longer fully aligned with the old world, but you have not yet built resonance with the new one. The people who understood you through your wounds no longer recognize you, and the people who might understand you through your clarity have not yet appeared. This in-between space can feel isolating, and it is here that many people question themselves most intensely. They wonder if they are becoming cold, if they are losing empathy, if healing has made them less human. But what is actually happening is discernment. You are beginning to choose depth over familiarity, honesty over harmony, and presence over performance. And those choices reduce the number of connections that feel sustainable, at least temporarily. Jung understood this phase as part of individuation. He believed that becoming whole often requires separation, not as a permanent state, but as a necessary distance from collective patterns that no longer reflect your inner truth. Without that distance, the psyche cannot reorganize itself honestly. This does not mean you are meant to remain alone. It means the standards for connection are changing. You may find that you need more space, more silence, more simplicity. You may prefer one meaningful conversation to many polite ones. You may notice that your social energy has become more selective, not because it has diminished, but because it is no longer scattered. This selective withdrawal is not a failure of healing. It is one of its costs. And like most costs worth paying, it is rarely advertised. But this phase, too, is transitional, because what follows is not isolation, but integration. And that is where the sense of being lost begins to soften into something else entirely. If there is one misunderstanding that causes the most suffering during this process, it is the belief that awakening is meant to deliver certainty. That healing should replace pain with clarity, confusion with answers, and loss with immediate meaning. But psychologically, awakening does something very different. It removes false structures before it offers real ones. It clears space before it fills it. And for a time, that space feels like being lost. Not because you failed, not because you made a mistake, but because you are no longer being carried by identities, roles, and emotional patterns that once decided your direction for you. You are standing in the middle of a transition, a place where unconscious momentum gives way to conscious participation, where reaction slowly turns into choice. This phase does not feel triumphant. It does not feel resolved, and it rarely feels impressive. It feels quiet, unstructured, demanding, which is why so many people rush to escape it, reattaching to old identities, new labels, or narratives that promise relief from uncertainty. But if you can remain here without rushing to fill the space, something subtle begins to take shape. Not a new mask, not a new performance, but a more honest relationship with yourself. One that no longer needs suffering to feel real, or intensity to feel meaningful. If you feel lost after healing, it does not mean the awakening was a lie. It means the illusion you were living inside has fallen away faster than something new could replace it. And that uncomfortable gap is not empty. It is where integration begins. If this reflection felt less like inspiration and more like recognition, you are not alone. Here, we explore the parts of inner change that don't translate into slogans or before and after stories. If you want to continue this journey with psychological depth and honesty, consider subscribing. Until then, be patient with yourself. You are not lost. You are between versions,